Good evening and good morning, everybody. I hope that you had a wonderful day in the South African European zone, and that you are having a wonderful morning in the US. It's great to be with you. My name is Etienne from Walt, from Neurozone, neurologist and CEO of Neurozone at the moment. Also looking at thought leadership and really fascinated by the way that neuroscience is affecting everything that we do. It's great to be with you today. What we are going to do in this masterclass is an extremely important topic, which probably requires way more than just an hour of our attention. But I'm going to try to discuss this idea of team effectiveness with you from a Neurozone perspective. Of course, it's not only a Neurozone perspective, but really from a neuroscience perspective. You are experts in the field of leadership development, organizational development, learning and development, human capacity building, and of course, team effectiveness. So my contribution as a neuroscientist is modest from the perspective of the neuroscientific, looking through the lens of a neuroscientist to the way that we collaborate and operate as human beings in the collective. Then I would effectively just say I would try to provide you with another lens into this incredibly complex field of team effectiveness, where humans collectively work together, and where humans actually have to really perform in a low energy, high yield state, if you may. I just heard that somebody says my screen is not clean. I wonder if this would make a difference. Is this any better? Let me just see if I can do this for a second. Of course, no, you see nothing. What does that look like? Can anybody just give a little quick thumbs up for me in that regard? Oh, phenomenal. Okay, thanks, Toby, and thanks, Ita. Thanks, everybody. Okay, well, from the misty cliffs, I was going to say, of South Africa, Cape Town, back into reality with you. And so let's jump away to, by actually just discussing this idea of team effectiveness. As I said, you as experts understand the field from a very practical perspective of looking at the success factors that drive the team effectiveness quest. Of course, it'd be great to on this masterclass. I really view this masterclass as a conversational opportunity, and so you will see in your chat box. I see most of you actually are using your chat box. Please address to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can read the question. And let me then fire away by, as always, use a PowerPoint screen, a little PowerPoint slide, so that we can at least just have some direction. And I'm going to see if I can find the slide now. In fact, it's probably this one. Yes, here we are. And so the idea of team effectiveness, why we chose this beautiful prismatic and also a very appealing artistic impression of a team working together. It just really demonstrates the synchronicity of a variety of individuals working as a whole, providing something which as an individual we would not have expected, so beautifully, so holistic, and with so much what I would call a low energy, high yield state. Of course, that is how complex adaptive organisms do actually work collectively together when we actually go into sync. And this synchronicity is also something which we now are finding we can measure, and we can actually measure this in a variety of ways. And so this is something I would like to share with you. Before we fire away with that, just once again, just the neuroscientific or the Neurozone definition of business to the brain, so that we know that we are actually really slap bang in the center of the we. We use our skills and knowledge, and you can also add expertise, to allocate resources together and to distribute these resources fairly in order to stay alive, survive, and thrive in life. Just a few notes. Again, as always, the we is a collective, and we aggregate into groups. And very fascinatingly, that we also have analogies. In society, we aggregate into families, if you may. And so the families make up, if you may, society. Society does not aggregate into families. Families make up society. And so the core unit of, which is where bonding lives, where trust lives, really is an organic family, as opposed to a biological family. And you're very lucky if your organic family later in your life is also your biological family, but very often this is not the case. So the idea that the organic family forms really through bonding, forms the core unit of society, really constitute, in a sense, the analogy in organizations, where organizations as society then have the organic family really expressing themselves in teams. And so the idea that we work in small teams, in small groups, where we can actually really hear each other, understand each other, and then together collectively really provide this high energy, high yield, low energy state, an outcome which really, in another way, is just saying the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, and so that really speaks to an efficient and effective, complex, adaptive group or organism. In that sense, this is an interesting analogy, right? I find it quite fascinating that you can have this interesting analogy in organizational team, society, families, and of course you can actually extrapolate into other areas of life where we also group. But let me just make that note then, that a team is a very unitary construct that is now, I was almost going to say, reviving itself in its importance over the past few years. Of course, it's always been at the core of how organizations work. With the advent of the new world, if you may, the fourth industrial revolution, everything else that comes with this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, everything disruptive and rapidly evolving. The whole idea of actually really going back to the teams and that unitary grouping and trying to understand how can we actually stay alive, survive, and thrive and perform at our best within teams so that we can actually be well and, of course, be successful as organizations has become increasingly important. And so I think that's just the context that you all understand very well. And so having said that, we've got a good context. We've positioned ourselves and positioned team effectiveness as a critical component of high performance, but not only for that, also to prevent burnout, to build resilience within individuals, also within teams, to ensure that we are actually well and that we do not implode in this volatile environment. And in fact, as you know, burnout is rife at the moment. We have to continuously talk about this burning platform of burnout, of people who are because of chronic stress in the workplace, are reducing lifespan, but also performance, and of course, becoming ill over time. And so it's important to continue to that conversation in the background, in the backdrop. And so team effectiveness in itself, with good news, of course, attached to that statement, it really improves the resilience of individuals, move them into a baseline relaxed physiological state, and prevent burnout through that, but also unlock high performance. And we're going to get into this whole idea of team effectiveness now in another way. So having said that, let's for a moment just look at this idea of teams. Of course, there are many ways of describing teams. There's no one correct way of doing that. So maybe I can just use this very complicated and typical academic description, which Kozlowski and Bell in 2013 coined. They talked about teams comprising these collectives who exist to perform organizationally relevant tasks. And so they actually explained this within the context of an organization. And I think it is fair to do that, right? Because teams and families, et cetera, always within organizations, society, et cetera, within a larger context, that actually perform organizationally relevant tasks. It is linked to a belonging system, if you may, through a collective culture and a collective understanding of what the vision is. And then share one or more common goals, interact socially, exhibit task interdependencies. So basically, there's an interaction that gives cohesion, glue the team together, share the common goals. So there's a goal that needs to be achieved. There's individuals are glued together to become a team as a unit, which we need to, as a organism, if I may, now have to achieve the task, and then exhibit task interdependency. So all the fractals in the system, being the team members in this new system called the team, have to exhibit interdependencies with each other, and of course through interaction socially they continue to connect themselves and glue themselves in a sense. And then of course, apart from that, you can't actually become one complete solitary unit. You have to actually maintain and manage boundaries, and that's also embedded within an organizational context. And of course, now this becomes quite complicated, setting boundaries and constraints. This constrains the team and influences exchanges with other units in the broader entity, which also speaks to organization. It speaks to the fact that you always look for cultural belonging within society, within organizations. So a team is also never really on their own. They belong very much like a sports team that belongs to a union, which belongs to a nation, et cetera, if you want to think about the Rugby World Cup as an example. So that constrains the team, but also, and that context also then sets boundaries. And then there are exchanges between the units within that particular broader entity. So it's a very fascinating way that we, if you look at teams, it's just such a beautiful, complex, adaptive system when you think of living organisms. Sure. I'm just looking at this and I'm just thinking by myself how profound it is that we really aggregate into teams so naturally. And this is not something that has been thought up by somebody who came up with the idea of a team. This is the way we function, and this is the way we organically function, which means that we aggregate into groups to achieve our goals at a lower energy input, effectively meaning that the workload is reduced, and that the outcomes or what we achieve is in greater abundance. And this idea of a low energy, high yield state, which really drives, if you may, the organism, being humans, is such a profound underpinning theme. And I'm just completely astounded every time I look at this and I think it's so important. And it is at this point that I need to make this statement again, that remember, the sky is not the limit. Yes, the sky is the limit. It applies to inspirational optimism and belief of what is possible. But when it comes to energy is finite. And the energy that we can assign to tasks is finite. The capacity, the capabilities we have to actually overcome challenges, once again, that has to be in place. And so there are a number of factors that we know in teams now need to be in place to actually achieve goals. Otherwise, the workload, the so-called neurological load, is going to be too high. But it all, in a sense, comes down to a low energy, high yield state, a natural aggregation. And in a sense, one of the jobs that we have as in this wonderful world of human capacity building, whether this is from a neuroscientific or from an organizational development perspective, is to really stand back with a bit of with real humbleness and awe, and try to observe what happens when there is this incredible synchronicity that starts to take place. Also, something we call neuronal flow, or that flow state in which a team starts to go into when they have this low energy, high yield. At a certain critical point, they just go into this flow state. And doesn't that term flow make so much sense now? If you think about flow, the synchronous dance or that teams actually can perform to achieve so much more at such a low energy input for the individual fractals or individuals within the team. And of course, that is probably the optimal low energy, high yield state. So having said enough of this idea of teams, now let me start to move. It's probably the right place to start to talk about this idea of neuroscience and team processes. Now, this is an article that's been written by these individuals down here, and I have to just acknowledge them And I want to actually really take this this article as for a component of our discussion as a template. And just before I do that, I would actually want to actually take this idea of, if you think neuroscience and team processes, just go back to the first statement that is being made by these individuals in this particular article, where they review this idea of neuroscience and team process. The first important point they make is that individuals, of course, make up teams, and therefore individuals need to be optimized. And the idea that individuals are optimized, that their own load is at a right sort of pace, they've got the right capabilities, they're assigned the right assignment to the tasks, and they are optimized in terms of their own capacity, is so pivotal. And this is, of course, where Neurozone has spent a lot of time in the last decade. And of course, here you see the model without the 4 core capacities in the center, just actually focusing your attention on the drivers, and then, of course, these behaviors and states that make up these driver systems. And this is, as we said, a comprehensive, fluid, continuous model that we are using and really describing it now in a code, as we've described. And this is the kind of the code we're talking about. All these behaviors and states now pivot around a particular outcome. And this particular outcome that we are now starting to use more and more, especially in our team analytics, has got to do with this idea that every single one of you and me are at any time somewhere along this spectrum, from high risk for burnout to high performance readiness at this top end, moving to a 100 score. So somewhere in between here, you and I find ourselves continuously, and the buffer that takes us away from burnout and moves into readiness, performance readiness, is resilience. And so remember that this spectrum, this is what everything is about. When you think about individuals who need to be functional, not dysfunctional, not ill, be well, do not burn out, be ready to performance at your best, this is still pivotal for every form of team effectiveness. This is also, as I said, recognized by the authors in this article, the experts in the field of team effectiveness. You have to have this in place. And so back to the model, very important to understand that if you want to have an optimized team for high team effectiveness, you really cannot really do team effectiveness without looking after the individuals individually, and of course within the collective, also collectively, but as individuals. And the team analytic that Neurozone uses at the moment is very much focused, largely focused on the individual as an individual by him or herself, but also within the team context, because you and I don't function outside of that. And even the team analytic helps individuals as a team to actually achieve this. And then there are a number of other components that speaks more to the way that the team effectively operates. So we'll get back to that in a second. And so there's a code for high performance for every single one, and then there's a code, as we said, for everyone. And now the problem now is, if you take this and you just put it together, you don't really get a team, because something else has to happen in this team. There needs to be synchronicity. There needs to be a coherence and a certain way that this team now actually starts to function together. You need components of glue which actually glue them together. We know that quite a few of these are actually within this code, and I'll demonstrate it to you that there's a lot in here that you can actually use in your team effectiveness if you want to achieve that low energy, high yield state that we all are so desperately looking for. In fact, I think I should just go one back again and just wait for a moment. Let me just pause at this point and just think where we have now, what we have done up to now. We've discussed this idea of the team, how important the team is within the context of the organization, and also said, okay, what can neuroscience now tell us about a team? And the first thing we said is individual optimization is critical. Then we said, okay, now we have to have a collective optimization of a team. Now there are many conventional methods of studying team effectiveness. I'll get back to the questions a bit later if that's okay. Let me just complete the conversation, the monologue, with apologies, but then I'll actually have a quick look at the particular remark question. What actually do we how do we, these conventional measures that look at team effectiveness, are they relevant still? Are they important? The answer is absolutely yes. Undoubtedly, they're critical. So the conventional, well-validated psychometric studies and surveys and performance outcomes that are measured to look at the efficiency or say something about this effectiveness of a team, they are still very important. And so neuroscience really provides a different lens at this point. And I'll explain what the thinking is. If you want to understand that, you first of all just want to actually look at what is neuroscience doing at the moment. I mean, apart from doing this, looking at the code from a neuroscientific perspective and a neuroanalytic perspective and behavioral perspective that Neurozone has got here, there are also other techniques. There are imaging techniques. There are other forms of technology that are used. And so this is the technology, a little technology picture. And I'm going to take you through every single one of those. Let me just first look at this conversation. Oh, hello, Ita. Could you share the paper you referred to, link? Yes, I will indeed. I just can't do it now in the moment. But thanks for that. And I will remember to do that. Okay, excellent. So let's talk about these neuroscience techniques that are used to assess team effectiveness. And of course, this is not all in the paper that I mentioned. In fact, this is what is out there at the moment that we've been really collecting over the past number of years. And I'm just mentioning those that are really useful, and also one that is actually pretty useless. So the first one is which one is useless? It's the one that everybody knows about. It's this functional MRI machine. So the functional MRI machine, as you know, give you these beautiful pictures of the brain, little slices and cuts, this from the front, from the side, and from the top and to the bottom, actually from the bottom up. And basically you can see all kinds of things lighting up if certain activities are being performed. Why is this a problem? Well, it's quite clear here, right? Big machine, one bed, or at least one person go in and do their thing. This is not a team, right? So the problem is that it's impossible really to do functional MRI studies on team effectiveness unless you actually have a certain way that there's communication between individuals within certain different machines. Even that's a problem because of the incredible noise that this particular machine, the fMRI machine, creates. It's a bit like drilling and hammering, things are hammering in there, and it's very uncomfortable. And at best, quite a claustrophobic experience. So we're not a great fan of functional MRIs or these magnetic resonance imaging type of imaging. But to the right here, there's quite a fascinating and actually very useful way of studying team effectiveness. And here you see individuals wearing these caps, which is called a quantitative EEG, that's electroencephalography caps. And so these little sensors, those little dots that you see on the brain, are actually measuring the brain waves, the electricity that they receive on the surface of the brain that is now picked up by these electrodes. And of course, then it creates an image. And this image has got value because if you now have certain filtering software that now takes out all the noise when you move and you do all kinds of things, you can actually see that there's a particular pattern now in the brain that has got a certain rhythmical oscillations, and it creates a rhythmical sort of pattern of electrical pulsations. And the idea of these electrical pulsations, of course, is we want to see what happens with these individuals and collectively within the group when certain aspects of team efficiency or team effectiveness are being demonstrated. So you can't just look at an EEG, you have to look at it within the context of, for example, video and ways that you actually collect the information of what's happening in the team at the same time, so that you can actually understand how this relates to EEG. Of course, this is not 100% essential. If you know that you want a certain oscillatory outcome, a certain kind of wave pattern, and in certain areas of the brain, and you actually want that all to be synchronized, and that is a good outcome for team synchronization, then of course that's what you're looking for if you're just measuring the outcome. And of course, this is something we are very interested in. So we are interested, and I'll explain that in a little illustration when we get to that point. But functional, or the so-called functional MRIs are not working that well, as we said, and we can't really use that. But we can really use quantitative EEG as a great measure and very promising to look at team effectiveness going forward. And it's already being studied quite extensively. Of course, those in academic laboratories. What are these? Well, this is facial recognition, right? So you can actually, this looks like Spider-Man gone wrong, but of course, this kind of facial recognition systems and voice recognition becoming increasingly valuable. The idea is, the reason is because, well, these kind of measurements provide you with big data systems. Of course, the EEG also does that, right? So you can actually, the more and more data we have, the more patterns we can recognize, the more we can relate them to certain outcomes, and we can actually then start to make pattern inferences and predictions of what's going to happen in this team going forward. And of course, this is always a cap on the head, whereas what you have here are actually easier ways of measuring. So if I can have the right kind of video camera set up in the boardroom, I can actually do this and do facial recognition studies and start to actually get pattern inferences from that. And we know of there are, of course, research and even commercial companies who are working on solutions in this space. It's actually fairly premature yet. But this one is not that premature. This one is the voice, where you use voice recognition, but you use it not only for all the inference patterns, you use it for a very specific reason. And this is where you measure social interactions between individuals in the team. And the way that those individuals interact. So you're not that interested in what they say, you're not interested in the words themselves, but you're interested in the length of the conversation, the heights of the conversation, and so there's some emotional value that is assigned to that as well. And what you see to the far right here is this voice recognition software, which has now given you a so-called, I would call this a sociogram, because it's the sociometer, the sociometer, if you may, that is actually measuring in each individual, making these measurements using the voice to find an interesting pattern in this conversation between the different team members and the way they relate to one another. Now, isn't this fascinating? Because we've got a number of things here. We've got an EEG in the top right. We've got interesting facial and voice recognition software here. And then, of course, we don't have the functional MRI machine. So it sort of simplifies it a bit. And what I'm going to really focus on now is I'm going to focus on these two. I'm going to focus on the EEG, the quantitative EEG, the so-called QEEG, which is quantitative EEG. And then I'm going to focus on the sociometer. Just give you some indication of what has been found of value when you use these measurements to measure certain to measure team effectiveness, right? Because what we've done, as we said individuals need to be optimized. And so Neurozone's got a system for that. And also we work within teams to do that. But now we want to see if the team is functioning at their best, whether they are really effective. And now you have conventional ways of measuring. There are success factors that have been well defined out in the literature, and as consultants, you understand that. So now you're going to measure those components. You're looking at, for example, the SCARF model that Neuroleadership uses. Great model that I think the whole, it really works in that space. When you think about collective collaboration, those underpinning pre-requirements of social safety and of fairness, of trust, of authenticity, and so that kind of collaboration. I'm actually just fumbling when I think about the whole acronym, but that's not that important. The point is that those are components that are well understood, and so and relatedness, right? So we actually have to understand how does that drive team effectiveness. If they're not there, you've got a problem, and so that's a requirement. But then there's also a way of measuring effectiveness. In between, there is an outcome that is happening in the brain that we are trying to understand, and that's the EEG. I think that's where this EEG's kind of value. It shows how everybody goes in this kind of sync and how that works. But then also we have these measurements that say something about the way people relate to each other. And I think those are two different things, okay? So we measure two different things. One is social interactiveness, the social skills, the way we relate to each other. And then there's this outcome-based, says, if you actually go into sync, your brain goes into sync, that actually has a great predictive value for your great outputs that you're looking for, low energy, high yield as a team. And we can measure that, of course, with the EEG as well. And so that's a summary of where we're going now. And I'm going to share now a little bit of detail with you on these two particular measurements. So here you see the EEG. This is the quantitative EEG technique. And what you see here in this corner, this actually, I thought maybe I should blow this up here and make it big, but you know, it's almost superfluous. What you see here are numbers and numbers of waves. And you can have 8 waves. That's called an 8 lead. You can have 16 lead EEG. And these people here, let me see, how many do they have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, they might have 12 leads or even a little bit more, but it might be a 12 or a 16 lead EEG that they have. So you can see all these dots, right? So those are electrodes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the top there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It might be 5 or 6, and then there's another 4 there. So it's 4 and 4 and 6, which basically gives you a 16 lead. And then you have a 16 lead EEG, which gives you less information than a 24 lead EEG. And the 24 lead EEG is probably now viewed as the best way to actually measure what's happening in the brain and in different brains. And it gives you a much better, more sensitive picture of what's happening in this team dynamics. In fact, while I was still working in a practice, seeing patients with epilepsy or potential epilepsy or with problems, functional problems in the brain, the EEG that we use there would have a 32 lead. So you can't work with less than 32 leads if you want to make a very clear clinical diagnosis of a little dysfunction in a very specific part of the brain. But you can understand, if I want to see something of a global pattern that's emerging, then I don't need all 32 leads. And so I'm not actually interested in a very localized specific dysfunction. I'm more interested in the functional network of the brain as it works. It's actually quite fascinating. So you can see that you can actually get away with less electrodes and still get a very valuable outcome. Otherwise, this would be a cap with a very uncomfortable cap with so many different leads that you have to actually stick onto the head with a bit of gel, etc., etc. So this is not something which is done every day in every setting. This is more research-based, as we've said. We are really interested in finding new techniques coming our way very soon that will be derived from these kind of techniques that are being used in the research laboratories. So how does this, what is the quantitative EEG? What is it? These are major applications. And the major applications that we've seen is that we can say something about the engagement, the neurological engagement and the focus and interaction that individuals in a team will exert when the team leader speaks. And so that doesn't speak to a high-powered member only, it also speaks to inspiration, the way that they actually work in coherence with their team leader. And so that kind of engagement can actually be assessed by using an EEG. The next one that's really very valuable is this idea of neurological load. It sort of speaks to this mathematical, if you may, sum between there's a demand and then there's capability. And of course, that makes a lot of sense to you, me. We understand that, right? Every individual has got, if you have to overcome a task, there's a certain demand that the task poses. And of course, and that requires energy. And then I have capabilities, and the more capability I have to overcome this task, the less energy I have to assign to the task. And the more I have a skill as opposed to just knowledge, or expertise as opposed to skills, the less energy I have to assign to overcome the task. And so my neurological load is very low. So that capabilities refers to this idea of knowledge, skills, expertise. Isn't it quite fascinating? And so that idea is that you actually use them to overcome the challenge, which is the demand, which is to allocate resources. That we're back to the definition of business to the brain. And that actually speaks to the neurological load that every single individual then has to actually achieve this. If the load is too high, it will potentially, if it continues, it will lead to a stress and a chronic stress response and burnout. If the team neurological load is too high due to some dysfunctions in the team, not necessarily only the lack of capability, because capability can be great, but if the demand is high and the demand is not too high, but there are other factors that actually lead to a dysfunction in the team, the neurological load will also be very high. So the one thing I didn't add here is this idea of the way that the team coherence operate. So there's another third component you have to add to a neurological load when it comes to team effectiveness, and that is that coherence of the team itself. This is a direct translation from the individual neurological load, individual demand versus individual capability. And this can be measured with the EEG, right? So that's quite fascinating. And the other one that EEG is being used for quite effectively now is for this idea of emotional contagion. And this speaks to the contagiousness of emotions. It means that you and I can mirror each other. We start to work together better when I'm engaged, you're engaged, we collaborate, we have empathy, we empathize with each other. And now we start to come into some kind of congruence. And that's where the flow starts to happen, right? So there's this synchronicity that starts to develop. And that in a team at large is very powerful. So this idea of emotional contagion, neurological mirroring, very, very important. And once again, is also used in the research to actually figure out how can we understand more of what happens when teams and their leaders interact. To what extent is the neurological load? What is the load? What is the load in the neurological system in the brain when there's team functioning? And what is this? How do you actually get this flow state? So this is quite complex, but these are the three major ones that is being used in EEG work. Now I'm going to go to the next one. So let me just take you back to this idea that you and I, we looked at EEG now. And now I'm just going to take us to this one. And this is quite fascinating. If you look at this, I'm going to show you something about the sociometer. So the sociometer works like this. And so Human Dynamic Lab at MIT invented this. It's called a sociometric badge. So this little badge is just basically individual uses this. And so in the team, everybody uses their badge. And it measures the tone of the voice a person uses. And it just listens to you. It screens out everybody else. And it also, and so it actually also can figure out if people face one another, how much they gesture, how much they talk, listen, and interrupt. So you can see it's quite a sensitive and also quite standardized system already. So it actually picked up these different types of interactions, different types of voice changes. And because of that, it can predict what you are doing now, how much you walk, listen, interrupt, and so on. And of course, your gesture and so on. So important, the sociometer does not record the words, but they are determined because they're determined irrelevant in these measurements. And what the sociometer then measures is it says, how often do you speak? How much do you say when you speak? When do you go silent? How much is there interaction between you and somebody else? Are you facing that person or not? And what are you doing with your gestures? And are you interrupting somebody else? That's a mouthful, isn't it? Bit like a pun. But you can see the sociometry there. A very fascinating little machine. And the studies with sociometry have given these three, and I've actually taken this directly from an article. With gratitude, what you can see here down here is sort of an illustration of what sort of happens when you use a sociometry. You can sort of show how these interact, what they look like, where there are negative interactions, where there are positive interactions. It's quite a fascinating construction that you can make with a sociometer. So the whole social interaction, using certain social skills to do this. So social skills so important to ensure that your sociogram, if you may, looks balanced and is indicative of this capacity that you can generate now, or capacity you can actually exert now to go into flow and have a high yield with a lower energy assignment. So what you see here is sort of a half measure. There's some negative aspects there, and this interaction here is not great. So this is not an optimal prediction for team effectiveness, if you may. You want quite a balanced system. So Successful team members, they say, generate a large number of ideas. This is quite fascinating, isn't it? Ideas in short contributions to conversation. So they don't talk long words, long sentences, to put it that way. They just interact, stop, and then there are dense interactions, meaning that they alternate between advancing their own ideas and responding to the contributions of others. So there's this conversation, continuous conversation for successful team members. And so very, very rich information being shared in this kind of thick areas there. And then successful members contribute ideas and reactions and taking turns more or less equally, ensuring a wide diversity of ideas. Remember this idea of equal turn taking, something which has also been, MIT has been clear about that when they looked at the C factor, that the more equal turn taking you have, the higher your C factor, which trumps the individual G. So there's a lot here that's quite useful to understand. And once again, also we see this equal turn taking, and we've used those components, of course, in our assessment as well when we look at collective creativity, which speaks to the successful sociogram as well. So very fascinating sociometer. So where are we now? We've looked at this these two components. To take you back, we've looked at the sociogram here. This is just a beautiful little picture of talking about the voice recognition software and how you can actually recognize voice and stoppage and so forth. And then you've got the EEG on that side. And so, as we said, facial recognition still being used in a bit more research-based setting. And of course, it's very often easier to just have a little sociometer, isn't it? Just fascinating. I think it's so innovative. Right, and so if you getting to this point, the question is, can we actually, and let me just go one step back, can we actually now derive some kind of a model from what we've now discussed? Time is actually flying. We only have maybe 12 to 15 minutes left, and then we're at the end of the hour. But I would really want to think with you in terms of, what have we seen now? Is there some way we can actually put all of this together? We saw that that individual optimization is extremely important at the baseline. Then we have seen that there are components that a team need to have. There's construction of the team, and there's a social capacity, social skills. They need competencies within the team. We talk about capabilities. There's no use if you don't have your individual capabilities that you can exert into the team to be effective to achieve your goal. And then, of course, at the end of that, there are ways to actually now look at a number of almost certain soft skills to really get to that point of flow. So this is just one way of looking at it. And I'm by no means suggest that this is the best way. This is just a way of actually looking at what we've just seen and say, okay, is there a way of actually building a team effectiveness model? And so my thoughts were that these are components that one can think of. And of course, we can actually think about this together in the next few minutes. At the core of everything, there's individual optimization of the brain-body system. Then there's individual skill sets and competencies. We talk about that idea of your capabilities. You need capabilities. And as we know that from our Neurozone's work, that if you, that an optimized individual brain-body system provides you with acceleration for the mastery of the competencies that you need here, your skill sets and competencies, but also you need interactive social skill sets. Now, you can probably say it's all actually clumped together, but I wanted to separate them because the one is about the capabilities you exert within the team needed for the particular task, very field specific, if you may. For example, engineers have to be great engineers and problem solvers, and they can fix the problem, whereas interactive social skill sets is a different type of skill set that is so essential for team effectiveness. And then finally, there's this idea that you actually have neurological load. Why I'm saying this is that the neurological load needs to be low. The lower the load, this is an outcome. You start and measure outcome here. So these two are outcome measures in the model. I want to once show that the neurological load is low. Then I want to show that there's a biochemical collective brain synchronization. This speaks to this idea of the emotional contagion, the mirror neurons. It speaks to this, the capacity for this whole team to go into this low energy, high yield state. And these are the two major things you actually want to measure. To be sure that your load is low, to ensure that you have the potential for the synchronization. You might even argue that if your load is too high, you're not going to go into synchronization anyway. And I think that might be right. I'm not sure that it's been studied properly, though. And then finally, you want to measure your team performance outcomes, because the conventional ways of measuring team effectiveness still applies. So can you see, in a sense, what I'm trying to sort of get to is that if you now say, well, what is a contribution, relative contributions to these on the left, then we can say, well, what we do at Neurozone is very much focused on this individual and then also the collective within the team, brain-body system optimization at a very clinical, more sort of at the sort of neurobiological level. Then you have the individual skill sets and competencies that requires personal mastery. And of course, this is the personal mastery programs. There are other continuous learning you can add in here to actually have all of that in place. And then you need interactive social skill sets. And so to measure that, of course, there are programs that can build this, but this is how we can measure it, right? We can measure it with a sociometer, we can measure it with surveys. And then, of course, we want to measure these two, neurological load and biochemical collective brain synchronization. And that's where the quantitative EEG comes in. So you can actually see that you could use a sociometer to talk about your interactive social skill set. You can use a quantitative EEG that really works with the synchronization and neurological load. And then eventually you're looking at team performance outcomes, and there's conventional measures. So if you have these four very well optimized in your outcome side, this would be the inputs that you need to be optimized, and this is the outcome you're measuring. I would think that at least this is a model, how we can actually say what are the components we really want to look after properly. Having said that, I want to hold you, just hold this for a second, and then I'm going to share with you, having said all of these, just actually embroider a bit on these. I'm going to actually go into these three down here: the interactive social skills, my individual skill sets, competencies, and specifically actually focus on interactive social skill sets and the optimized individual and collective brain-body system. And let me for a moment just focus on that and share with you the summary of one of the gurus in team effectiveness. You can actually Google him if you want, Michael Platt from Penn State University. He's also from Wharton Business School. He does a lot of work in the space of neuroscience and of team effectiveness, the whole biochemistry of team effectiveness. And this is a summary of his one of his major talks, 8 lessons neuroscience teaches us about team effectiveness. And I'm just going to share this with you now. And this is what I'm going to actually then end off with, because we're quite theoretic at the moment. Now let's become quite practical. So to be quite practical, these are the 8 things he says, the major lessons that we've learned from neuroscience. One is you have to strengthen your social brain network. So that brain network is not your social network. It's not the people. This is the brain cells. So you want to strengthen your social brain network. And that means you actually will need to find ways that your brain network can grow and wire together and actually be more and more capable of socializing. That's the first one. The second one is you have to pay attention to others, not to your phone. So there's a real paying attention to others. That attention to others is extremely important. These sound fairly obvious, right? But it's actually not easy to achieve, as we always say. So that's number 2. The next one is very important to understand, and it says perceived power. If you have a perception of power, it reduces your empathy. So your perception of being part of a team, part of a bigger whole, and actually the way that you exert your strengths and your contributions is always towards the group and serving the group, as opposed to perceived power. Your empathy is higher, which is so incredibly important for collective creativity, of course, talking about team effectiveness. Hardwired biases shape the way we relate to others. Now, we all know that, okay? So that's not difficult to understand. Interesting enough is that small indicators, even small indicators of team cohesion, overcome hardwired biases and alter your empathy. It increases capacity to empathize. What is a small indicator? Well, it's sharing, let's carry, we all wear the same jersey, we're all Springbok supporters. So it gives us an indicator of team cohesion. It's a small indicator, but it overcomes hardwired biases and it alters our empathy as a group, as a collective, and so on and so forth. So these are important from a practical perspective. Think about practical things you can do in your team. When working together, heartbeats and brainwave synchronized. That heartbeat is probably one word. My and brainwave is probably also, but let's not talk about the spelling now. But the idea of heartbeats and brainwaves synchronizing is actually quite interesting. So the whole idea of synchronization of the brain-body system and of the collective is quite important. But it means that we have to work together. And so that's I suppose this lesson is more an indication as opposed to a practical tip. But then here's the other one: touch. And we know that, right? We know touch releases oxytocin for trust. But prolonged eye contact as well releases oxytocin for trust. Something that's quite valuable when you think about teams. A good balanced breakfast with low GI, so the low glycemic index, of course, that means unrefined carbs and protein, which also, by the way, reduces the GI even further. Very important, because that enhances your dopamine secretion, which enhances empathy and empathization and capacity for team effectiveness. So a good balanced breakfast is good for team effectiveness. If you balance it properly. Why am I laughing? Because it's just fascinating how all these things work together. And what does this mean from a Neurozone perspective? Maybe just looking at looking back at the code again. Strengthen the social brain network. It's all about human curiosity. Human curiosity enhances neuroplasticity in the right places. If you've got human curiosity, it's essential for empathy to build your cognitive empathy. There it is. Pay attention to others. Human curiosity, once again, is so important here as a driving force and the executive function, the attention system. Perceived power reduces empathy. Remember, we talked about the high-powered member's voice, and we talked about cognitive empathy in the code. They are the ones that actually are so important when you think about this lesson. When you think about hardwired biases shape the way we relate to others, well, functional fixedness, very important. It reduces the capacity for reducing our biases, and of course, mindset. Now, mindset is not one of our in the code, so I have to just point that out. But the rest here, all part of the code for high performance. Small indicators of team cohesion, overcome hardwired biases and alter empathy. Our sense of identity is so important as individuals and within the team, and of course, that is a great as we said, cohesion force. When working together, heartbeats and brainwaves synchronize, low energy, high yield. There's no one specific in the code here, but you can see that's what happens. That puts you in that state that can move into flow. And then touch and prolonged eye contact release, oxytocin bonding, easy to understand. And then, of course, the breakfast one, low GI foods. We know that that's part of the code. So the idea that the behavioral code speaks to 7 out of 8 lessons, and the 8th lesson is actually not really a particular action or behavior that you need to pay attention to. This is quite profound, I think, and it's quite useful to understand that. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you. We have 1 minute, then we are out of time. I hope that you enjoyed these thoughts with me as much as I did, actually studying the field a bit and looking at everything that's out there and trying to ways of putting it all together. And I'm sure that you will have thoughts and questions now. So for those of you who have to leave, thank you very much for joining us. I'll be around for another 5 to 10 minutes just on the Zoom. So for you who want to stay a bit longer, you're very welcome to fire your thoughts and questions now. Oh my goodness, I've actually, I see there are quite a few questions and thoughts. There's your article link. Thanks so much. Is it Conroy? Thanks for that. And then Wendy, Scarf, yes, thank you. Absolutely, thank you very much for that model. Is there a way to assess, Wendy, how to optimize the remote work in a team performance equation? Oh my goodness. So Wendy, my personal view is that everything we said here relate to teams who are in close proximity to each other. I need to see your eyes and sit with you. We need some touch. We need to be in close proximity. So that I think a remote worker cannot be part of a team building that kind of trust and really that what you need. And a remote team worker forms part of a social network, which is more part of the belonging space, which is part of our culture. But it's a very hard one. It's a tough one. I would love to get some more feedback on this, and we would love to study that a bit further. But I would argue that from root principles now, if you look at the ground principles of what we discussed, that a remote worker is at a is definitely at a disadvantage when it comes to trust and the team effectiveness, that team cohesion. Probably more closer to a network where culture is very important, a belonging system. 10 hearts beating as one. Thanks, Guru. Yeah, cool, man. Thanks, Guru. It's great to see you. Yeah. And then, yeah, it's so interesting. Ita, thank you. Nico, such a pleasure. Fiona, touch and prolonged eye contact in our current work environments could be taken the wrong way. Oh, interesting. I don't know. Well, I'm pretty convinced that all the isms and all the threats that we have in our current setting, and of course they are realistic. Therefore, of course, that not always good for us that we have all these incredibly threatening. What is the word? Probably boundaries that we set. I think enhances the harshness of the environments we work in, reduces the capacity for a human capacity. I don't have a solution for that, but I do think you've got a point. And where are we now? Peter, thank you. Yeah, thanks. It's a real pleasure. Such a pleasure, Mandy. Good news, is it possible for a remote team to work together if the foundation is built in the physical work? Okay, so good news, the same point that we made before, this idea of a remote team worker. I think a remote team loses out on these particular components of trust, once again, as we said. So it's probably more a belonging and cultural cohesion that you want to build in that space. But I don't think you're going to have an organic family analogy of the organization if you work remotely. I'd love your thoughts on that. You mentioned that how we measure team effectiveness. Hi, Ben. Has been solved, right? No, Ben, I'm sorry if I made that. I think we just have a number of very good, a number of good ways of measuring certain components of effectiveness. I don't think there's one single solution for team effectiveness. I think it's more the outcomes of teams that will be measured. What is the outcome? Can we actually produce what we need to produce in the time that needs to be done? How effective is that? Is a sports team winning? What's the winning percentage? Those kind of things. But when you think about the components that drive that, that has not been solved yet. And so, but I'd love to have a conversation with you on that. Yes, no, I think I was wrong in that, or at least I think there was a misunderstanding. Well, I didn't make it that clear. My apologies. Trying to see who this is because of the fact that I love to be a bit personal. So where are we? Steve, it's so good to see you here. Could you say a bit more about the high-powered member's voice and empathy? Yeah, so the high-powered voice is one of the, in our code, it comes up trumps as the most important derailer of a team effectiveness. The high-powered voice is very often, well, the high-powered voice leads to two things. One is that the high-powered voice very often has perception of high power, which reduces empathy in that individual and already causes a break in this very delicate balance of a team. The second one is that high-powered voice reduces the freedom, for the sense of freedom to voice my own opinion, and that happens not only in one person, but in a number of people. And so the lack of freedom to voice opinion once again also reduces that. If you may, you think about the whole idea of the way that the voice is measured, you can actually see that it reduces the balance of the team. So the team effectiveness is reduced in at least two ways if you think about a high-powered voice. And it's been well studied. My understanding, I'm just not 100% sure, Steve, but I think that comes from also from MIT, the Center for Collective Intelligence, having studied this. And so it's a two-edged sword, which destroys. And because of a lack of empathy, of course, you've got the reduced team effectiveness. What is the antidote for the leader? I think that's probably a question that sort of leads into that particular question. Just before I go to Karina, I think my thoughts are that if you, and this is just a thought, right? So we haven't substantiated this, but I'm just going to share a thought. Maybe just having worked with the Neurozone system for a long time now, my understanding is that the best leader of any team is the leader whose actions always lead to a bonding and belonging, which always ensures social safety. And so a leader in a boardroom setting when the stakes are, when the risks are not that high, for example, as opposed to a war zone, an operational theater, or a mine where you need certain ranking and certain execution, then that it requires the leader needs to be a very at least be an empathetic, collaborating, and facilitating type of leader who knows when to really execute as well and rank when it's needed. Now, that when it's needed is very, very seldom in executive or in boardroom meetings and meetings where teams meet, but it is necessary. We know it is needed. But in a war zone, my general ranks, and that makes me safe. It provides me social safety. So I think that's probably the situational leadership summarized in a way that we say the outcome is important. It's always going to be social safety needs to be preserved, and the low energy, high yield state is what we are looking for under these circumstances. So I'm just sharing some thoughts with you, Steve. I don't know the answers to this in every one of them. So, but thanks for that. I hope that sort of wasn't too far off the mark. And then Karina, thanks. Such a pleasure, Karina. This relates very well to the conversational intelligence course I did. Okay, cool. Thanks, Karina, for that. I'm going to make a note of that. Excellent to have you here, Julia. Such a pleasure. Wendy, once again, has this been used in an academic setting and in helping students better understand their strengths? Oh, that's such a good question, Wendy. I'm not sure that it has been. In fact, it might have been. You know, the world is big. We are currently starting to work with students, and so that's something that's exciting us a lot. But I can't answer your question, Wendy. Thanks for that. Yeah, great. Thanks, Vanessa. So good to have you here. Warren, can you share how the brain-body systems can synchronize rhythms with other parties? Is this chemical, electrical? It's both. It's both, Warren. The brain works in all. So remember that the chemicals that are secreted in the right areas that causes this functional system to work properly are secreted as a result of electrical activity. And so your electrical synchronization also leads to the synchronized release of chemicals, etc., etc. I hope that makes sense. Remember this idea that a neuron is an electrical system, secretes chemicals, so driven by the electrical current. I think that probably clinches that one, right? So Wendy, in a high school setting, no, we haven't tested it yet, and if anybody is interested in working in that space or with us on this, please let us know. It will be really something we would love to explore. Phenomenal, Steve. Great to see you here, and thanks, Wendy. So great to have you here. And then finally, fair enough. Shall we take the last one now because we have 1 minute left? Then it's 22. Are age groups such as teenagers as likely to suffer from burnout as adults? They have their own teams and structures. Yes, they are as likely, and they might even be more likely in some ways or another if you don't understand the important factors that actually prevent them from burning out. In fact, I often talk about early childhood development. A young baby, when a young newborn baby is born, the amygdalas, which the amygdalas, right, the eyes of the monster, they are already developed in the newborns. And so a newborn can have chronic stress. Chronic stress, it's called toxic stress in early childhood development, can lead to burnout. All the symptoms are pro-inflammation, and of course, reduce the development of the brain significantly. So chronic stress or toxic stress for early childhood development for children is a very, very real threat. And in this world that we live in, even more so. And of course, remember, if they can't actually really live and flourish in a digital world, they will burn out. So don't disallow them to do that either. You've got to find the balance. But at this point, we don't have time to talk about this any further. It will be fascinating to discuss this at some point, although this is not a Neurozone specific idea. We're probably going to have to talk in a different forum about this, but absolutely interesting. Right, Carlos, the concept of relational coordination aligns nicely to his work. I'm going to check that out, Carlos. Thank you very much for that. And it's great to see you here, Carlos, man. So great. And good morning to all of you in the US. Final question, Warren. While I understand how this works internally, how do we transfer this information to others? I think that's the, if you just look Michael Platt, and you look at the 8 lessons, which is a great summary, you'll probably see practical insights that you can use. And then, of course, as I've said, and just in all simplicity and all modesty as well, is that our system that looks after team effectiveness, the team analytic report system for teams, basically have got almost all of these, as I said, components that needs to be looked after practically. So one can actually look at a team and say, how can we actually work with you on those components in the team that are of greatest relevance and importance now for you for high performance. So that's something you might want to consider as well. Jan, it's such a pleasure. Great to see you here, Fiona and Warren. Phenomenal. I think this is the end. It's great to see you all. Cheers, man. Cheers, Ben. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful evening and day, and hope to see you soon again.